When you've lost the one person who made the world feel safe, everything else becomes survivable. That truth didn't arrive all at once. It settled slowly, like dust after a collapse, coating everything Eleanor touched in the days that followed. The funeral dispersed in small, quiet groups. Cars pulled away one by one, tires crunching against gravel, engines starting too loudly in the hush. Eleanor stayed where she was until the parking lot thinned, until the last stranger had offered condolences and walked away. Only then did she allow herself to turn back toward the church doors. Inside, the air still smelled faintly of flowers and incense. The echoes of footsteps bounced off the stone walls, making the space feel larger and lonelier than before. Eleanor paused near the aisle, her hand brushing the end of the pew where she'd sat just an hour earlier. It was strange how quickly a place could stop feeling sacred and start feeling empty. She didn't cry. That unsettled her more than anything else. She had cried enough over the past few weeks to feel hollowed out, like the tears had drained something essential from her. Now there was only pressure behind her eyes, a dull ache that never quite broke free. The drive back to her father's house passed in a blur of red lights and unfamiliar streets. She followed the same route she'd taken hundreds of times before, but everything looked different, like the world had shifted a few degrees off center. Houses felt quieter, trees seemed heavier, even the sky looked lower. When she pulled into the driveway, the porch light was already on. She didn't remember turning it on that morning. Her father must have. The thought struck her with sudden force, and for a moment she leaned forward over the steering wheel, breathing slowly, deliberately, until the tightness in her chest eased. Inside, the house greeted her with silence. She set her purse down on the entry table and stood there for a long moment, listening. No television murmuring from the living room, no kettle whistling in the kitchen, no footsteps moving from room to room. Just the quiet. Eleanor slipped off her shoes and walked through the house as if she were visiting a museum of her own life. Every object carried a memory. Her father's jacket still hung on the hook by the door. His reading glasses rested on the arm of his favorite chair. A half-finished crossword puzzle lay folded on the coffee table, pen tucked neatly inside. She sank into that chair, the leather creaking softly beneath her, and pressed her palm against her belly. "It's just us now," she whispered. The baby responded with a gentle kick, a small but unmistakable movement that reminded her she wasn't truly alone. She exhaled slowly, letting the rhythm of her breathing anchor her. That night, sleep came in fragments. Eleanor drifted in and out of shallow rest, dreams bleeding into memories. She saw her father smile, heard Michael's voice at the funeral, felt the weight of the envelope in her hands over and over again. Sometime before dawn, she gave up trying to sleep and padded into the kitchen. The clock on the stove read 4:17 a.m. She poured herself a glass of water and stood by the sink, staring out the window at the darkened backyard. This was the hour her father used to wake up when he couldn't sleep. He would make tea, stand right where she was standing now, and watch the sky slowly lighten. She remembered once asking him why he liked mornings so much. "Because they don't expect anything from you yet," he'd said. "You get to exist before the world asks you to be something." Eleanor wrapped her arms around her, absorbing the memory. The next few days unfolded in quiet repetition. She sorted through paperwork, answered calls from distant relatives, nodded politely as neighbors dropped off casseroles and awkward condolences. Everyone spoke to her carefully, as if she might shatter if someone used the wrong word. Michael's absence was loud. He didn't come by the house. He didn't ask how she was doing. Each message landed like a reminder that the life she'd known was already receding into the past. At night, Eleanor lay in bed with one hand on her belly and one on the empty pillow beside her. She thought about the years she'd spent making herself smaller so Michael could feel bigger, the conversations she'd softened, the instincts she'd ignored, the moments she'd excused. She didn't feel anger yet, only clarity. The letter from the law office arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, slipped neatly into the mailbox between grocery store flyers and a utility bill. Eleanor noticed the handwriting immediately. Precise, careful, deliberate. Her name written out fully, no abbreviations. She stood at the kitchen counter for several minutes, turning the envelope over in her hands. A part of her wanted to ignore it, to leave it unopened and untouched. The past few weeks had taught her that unexpected news rarely brought comfort. But her father's voice lingered in her mind, steady and reassuring. You'll always be okay. She opened the letter. The words were formal but respectful, requesting a meeting to discuss her father's affairs. Nothing more, nothing less. Downtown felt overwhelming when she arrived 2 days later. The streets buzzed with movement and urgency, people rushing past her with coffee cups and briefcases, all of them absorbed in lives that seemed to be moving forward without pause. The law office building rose above the sidewalk in clean lines of glass and stone. Eleanor hesitated before entering, suddenly aware of how out of place she felt in her simple dress and worn shoes. Inside, everything was quiet and polished. The receptionist greeted her by name, as if she'd been expected all along. The attorney's office was spacious but unpretentious. No flashy artwork, no trophies, just shelves of neatly organized files and a wide desk with a single framed photograph turned face down. I worked with your father for a long time, the attorney said, his voice calm and even. He spoke about you often. That surprised her. He was proud of you, the man continued, even when he worried. The letter he slid toward her felt heavier than it should have been. At first, Eleanor didn't understand what she was seeing. The numbers seemed abstract, detached from reality. It took several minutes for the meaning to settle in, and when it did, it knocked the breath from her lungs. This, this isn't possible, she whispered. The attorney didn't rush her. He explained carefully, answering her questions one by one, never once speaking down to her or assuming she wouldn't understand. He told her about the company her father had helped build decades earlier, about his decision to step away quietly, selling his shares and investing the proceeds conservatively. He wanted a normal life, the attorney said, and he wanted you to have one too, until the moment came when you might need more. Eleanor thought about the modest house, the simple routines, the way her father never spoke about money unless it was to remind her that it wasn't the measure of a person. And Michael? She asked before she could stop herself. The attorney's expression softened just slightly. Your father had concerns. He asked me to make certain arrangements, precautions. The words settled heavily in her chest. When she left the office later that afternoon, the city looked sharper, brighter, more defined. The same streets, the same buildings, but she felt as though she were seeing them from a new height. She sat in her car for a long time, hands resting on the steering wheel, feeling the weight of what she now knew. Michael still believed she was vulnerable, dependent, cornered. She didn't correct him. The divorce proceedings moved quickly. Eleanor cooperated fully, responding promptly through her lawyer, never arguing, never pushing back. Michael grew visibly more relaxed with each step, his messages growing almost cheerful toward the end. This is for the best, he wrote once. She didn't reply. When it came time to sign, Eleanor read every page carefully. She asked questions. She took her time. When Michael slid the final document across the table and watched her sign, satisfaction flickered briefly across his face. He never noticed the clause he initialed without reading. Freedom. By the time Eleanor's son arrived, the world had shifted again. Labor stripped her down to something raw and elemental. Hours blurred together, pain rising and falling in waves she thought might break her. But when it was over, when they placed her son against her chest, warm and crying and impossibly small, everything else faded into the background. She named him Thomas, after the man who had taught her what love looked like when it didn't demand anything in return. In the quiet hours of the night, Eleanor rocked him gently, whispering promises she fully intended to keep. She spoke about safety, about honesty, about kindness. She told him stories about his grandfather, about the way he laughed at his own jokes and hummed while he worked. Michael learned the truth months later. An article, a photograph, a headline he couldn't ignore. He tried to reach her then, panic bleeding through his carefully crafted messages. He showed up unannounced. He begged for conversations that were suddenly urgent. Eleanor declined all of it. Not out of spite, out of peace. Standing in the doorway of her new home one evening, Thomas asleep in her arms, Eleanor understood something fully for the first time. Life doesn't always break us to punish us. Sometimes it breaks us open. Sometimes it clears the space so we can finally grow. And sometimes the greatest power isn't proving someone wrong, it's building a life so full, so grounded, so true, that the people who once tried to diminish you no longer matter at all. The days that followed blurred together in a way that felt unreal, like she was moving through someone else's life. Eleanor stayed in her father's house, a modest place filled with quiet routines and old habits. The chair by the window where he drank his coffee every morning still held the faint impression of his weight. The bookshelf he organized by height instead of genre leaned slightly to one side, exactly as he'd left it. The garage smelled faintly of sawdust and motor oil, and for a moment she could almost hear him humming while he worked. At night, the silence pressed in on her chest until it was hard to breathe. Michael's messages came through her phone like distant noise, short, impatient, legal. My lawyer will be in touch. Please don't complicate this. We need this resolved quickly. She didn't respond. Some mornings she woke up reaching for her phone, instinctively wanting to call her father. Every time she remembered, it felt like losing him all over again. The grief didn't arrive dramatically anymore. It crept in quietly, disguised as habit, as muscle memory, as instinct, reaching for something that no longer existed. She found herself talking to him anyway. Sometimes it was in the kitchen while washing dishes he would never use again. Sometimes it was in the garage, standing beside half-finished projects she didn't know how to complete. Sometimes it was late at night, lying in bed with her hand on her belly, whispering updates about the baby as if he could still hear her. I'm scared, she admitted once, out loud, the words hanging in the dark. But I think you knew that already. The baby kicked, sharp and sudden, and Eleanor laughed softly through her tears. I know, I know. I'll be okay. One afternoon, a letter arrived addressed in careful handwriting. Not from Michael, from someone she didn't know. The law office address was downtown, the kind of building she'd always assumed was for people with important lives, people with things to protect. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time, the envelope unopened, her other hand resting on her belly. The baby kicked, firm and insistent, as if reminding her that she couldn't disappear into grief forever. She almost didn't go. Fear rose quickly, uninvited. Fear of bad news, fear of debt, fear that somehow, even after death, something could still be taken from her. The house, the last piece of stability she had left. But something in her father's voice echoed in her memory. You'll always be okay, I promise. So she went. Downtown felt loud and foreign, like she had stepped into a world that hadn't gotten the memo that her life had stopped. People moved quickly, phones pressed to ears, conversations overlapping. No one knew who she was or what she was carrying inside her body and her heart. The law office was quiet, polished, intimidating in a subtle way. The kind of place where decisions were made behind closed doors and lives quietly changed. The attorney was older, calm, and spoke her name like he'd known it a long time. I worked with your father, he said gently, for many years. Eleanor frowned. He didn't really need a lawyer. The man smiled softly. That depends on how you define need. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were numbers that didn't make sense at first. Too many zeros, too many pages. Figures so large they felt fictional, like something from a movie, not her life. She felt lightheaded. I think there's a mistake. There isn't. He didn't rush her. He waited while the reality tried to find a place to land. Then he explained, slowly, carefully, about patents her father had helped develop decades earlier, about early investments made quietly, consistently, about a company he'd helped build and then walked away from without ever needing credit or applause. He believed in long games and in privacy, Eleanor said. Eleanor shook her head. He lived like none of this existed. Yes, the man replied, on purpose. The explanation unfolded piece by piece, like a puzzle she hadn't known she was missing. Her father hadn't been hiding a double life. He'd been protecting one, protecting her. He didn't want you to live afraid, and he didn't trust your husband. The room tilted. Eleanor's breath caught. He knew? The attorney nodded slowly. He observed, he listened, he noticed how often your husband asked about money, about ownership, about security. Your father was cautious. That word hurt more than she expected. He loved you, the man continued. He planned for a future where you never had to depend on anyone who could walk away. The tears came then. Not the sharp, painful sobs of the funeral, but deep, shaking tears that came from somewhere buried far beneath the surface. Tears for the father who had protected her even in death. Tears for the woman she had been, believing love meant endurance. Tears for every moment she doubted herself while someone else quietly believed in her without condition. She cried until her chest hurt and her throat burned. The attorney didn't interrupt. He simply slid a box of tissues closer and waited. When she finally stood to leave, the sun was setting outside the tall windows, painting the city in warm gold. The world looked different, sharper, brighter, real. She sat in her car for a long time afterward, hands on the steering wheel, breathing. Michael still thought he'd won. That was fine. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor moved carefully, deliberately. She listened to advice, she asked questions, she learned more than she ever thought she'd need to know about finances, trusts, and protections. Most importantly, she learned patience. She didn't tell Michael anything. She didn't change her routine. She didn't suddenly upgrade her life or hint at anything different. She stayed in her father's house, drove the same car, wore the same clothes. She let Michael believe exactly what he wanted to believe. The divorce paperwork arrived shortly after. Eleanor read every page slowly, her lawyer beside her, explaining each clause. Michael wanted speed, he wanted finality, he wanted control. She gave him most of it. She didn't contest the apartment, she didn't argue over furniture or shared accounts. She signed where required, calm and composed. In exchange, she asked for one thing: full legal freedom, no shared obligations, no lingering ties beyond what was absolutely necessary. Michael barely glanced at the clause before signing. He was already mentally gone, already moving forward into the life he thought he'd won. Eleanor watched him sign with steady hands. That was the last time she saw him in person. The move happened quietly. The property her father had purchased years earlier sat on the edge of town, surrounded by trees and open sky. It wasn't extravagant in a flashy way, but it felt solid, thoughtful, safe. The first night she spent there, Eleanor slept deeply for the first time in months. Her son arrived early on a cool morning after hours of labor that stripped her down to instinct and breath. Pain came and went in waves she thought might swallow her whole. But somewhere in the middle of it, something shifted. She realized she was stronger than she thought. When they placed her son on her chest, warm and crying and real, she felt something settle inside her. This was it. This was the beginning. She named him Thomas, after her father. In the quiet nights that followed, Eleanor rocked him gently, whispering promises she meant with everything she had. "I'm here," she told him. "I won't disappear. You're safe." Months passed. Michael found out the truth the way the rest of the world did: an article, a headline, a photograph. He read it twice, then again. His chest tightened as reality finally caught up to him. He called, he texted, he showed up. Eleanor declined every attempt, not out of anger, out of peace. One evening, Eleanor stood by the window of her new home, Thomas asleep in her arms, watching the trees sway gently in the fading light. She felt grounded, steady, certain. Life hadn't broken her to punish her. It had broken her open. It had cleared space she didn't know she needed. And in that space, she had grown to someone who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, especially not to the man who thought silence meant defeat, when it had really been survival all along. She signed the divorce papers 3 weeks later without a fight. The room where it happened was small and overly bright, the kind of office designed to feel neutral, but somehow managed to feel cold instead. The walls were a pale gray, the table too smooth, the chairs slightly uncomfortable in a way that made you aware of your body even when you wanted to disappear from it. Eleanor sat straight-backed, hands folded in her lap, listening as her lawyer went through the documents one final time. Every clause, every consequence, every moment where she could still change her mind. She listened quietly, nodding when appropriate, asking only a handful of questions, not because she didn't understand, but because she wanted to be certain. This wasn't about pride or revenge or winning. It was about closing a door properly so it wouldn't creak open again later. Across the table, Michael looked restless. He tapped the pen against the paper, checked his phone once, then twice. He smiled more than the situation called for, a shallow smile that never quite reached his eyes. He wanted this done. She gave him the apartment, let him keep the furniture, didn't contest the accounts of the car. Every material thing that once symbolized a shared life suddenly felt weightless, almost irrelevant. Objects could be replaced. Peace could not. Her lawyer paused at one point and looked at her carefully. "You're entitled to more than this," he said gently. legally and otherwise. Eleanor met his gaze. I know. And she meant it in more ways than one. In exchange, she asked for one thing: full freedom. No shared obligations beyond what the law absolutely required, no room for reinterpretation later, no emotional loopholes disguised as legal language. She wanted the cleanest break possible, the kind that didn't echo. Michael barely glanced at the clause when it was his turn to sign. He was already imagining his life afterward, already stepping into the version of the future where this chapter was neatly closed behind him. He smiled when he handed the pen back, relief plain on his face. He thought he was walking away clean. Eleanor felt nothing watching him stand, straighten his jacket, and nod curtly in her direction before leaving. No anger, no regret, just a quiet certainty that whatever this had been, it was over. The weeks that followed were consumed by transition. She packed slowly, deliberately, choosing what to bring with her and what to leave behind. Every object carried a memory, and she learned quickly that memory didn't always equal meaning. Some things she kept because they felt warm in her hands. Others she let go of without hesitation. The house felt different once the boxes started stacking up, less like a museum of grief, more like a place preparing to exhale. The move happened early one morning, the sky still pale and undecided. Eleanor stood on the porch of her father's house one last time, keys cold in her palm, and let herself feel it fully. The love, the loss, the gratitude, the ache. Thank you, she whispered, unsure whether she was speaking to the house or the man who had made it a home. The property her father had purchased years earlier sat just beyond the edge of town, tucked behind a line of tall trees that shielded it from the road. It wasn't extravagant in a way that demanded attention. It was solid, intentional, built to last. Sunlight poured through wide windows, pooling on hardwood floors. The air smelled clean, untouched. The silence wasn't heavy here. It felt like space, like possibility. The first night she slept there, Eleanor woke once just before dawn. For a moment, she panicked, disoriented, her hand flying instinctively to her belly. Then she listened. Nothing. No distant traffic, no neighbor's television, no unresolved tension vibrating through the walls. She slept again, deeper this time. Labor began on a quiet afternoon weeks later. At first, Eleanor thought it was just discomfort, another reminder that her body was changing in ways she couldn't fully control. But as the hours passed, the sensation sharpened, rhythm replacing uncertainty. She moved through the house slowly, grounding herself in familiar motions, breathing through the waves as they rose and fell. By the time she reached the hospital, exhaustion had already settled deep into her bones. Labor was long, painful, exhausting. It stripped away pretense and expectation, reduced everything to breath and instinct and endurance. Time stretched and folded in on itself. There were moments when she thought she couldn't possibly continue, moments when fear whispered that she wasn't strong enough. And then she remembered her father, the way he faced problems without drama, the way he trusted process, the way he never doubted her ability to rise, even when she doubted herself. She breathed, she pushed, she stayed. When they placed her son on her chest, slick and crying and alive, something in her healed. The room faded into the background, the noise softened, the pain receded, replaced by a warmth so intense it almost hurt. She stared down at him, overwhelmed by how real he was, how small, how entirely dependent on her. "Hello," she whispered, her voice breaking. He quieted at the sound, his tiny fingers curling instinctively around hers, gripping with surprising strength. She named him Thomas, after her father. The name settled into place like it had been waiting all along. In the days that followed, Eleanor moved through a haze of exhaustion and awe. The hospital room filled with soft beeps and hushed voices, nurses coming and going, instructions blending together. But through it all, Thomas remained steady against her chest, a constant weight that anchored her to the present. At night, when the world grew quiet, she held him close and let herself feel everything she'd postponed. The grief, the relief, the fear, the love. Every loss rearranged itself into something that finally made sense. She understood then that some endings don't arrive to destroy you, they arrive to make room. And as she watched her son sleep, his tiny breaths warm against her skin, Eleanor knew with a certainty that didn't waver. This life was hers now, fully, finally. Michael found out about the money the same way everyone else did. An article, a headline, a photograph. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind that feels interchangeable with every other day when your life has quietly stalled. Michael sat alone at the small kitchen table of his apartment, coffee gone cold beside him, scrolling mindlessly through news on his phone. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, he was killing time, avoiding the weight of everything he hadn't fixed yet. Then he saw her name. At first, he didn't register it. His thumb paused mid-scroll, instant responding before his brain could catch up. He scrolled back. There it was again. Eleanor Whitman. The headline sat beneath her name in bold letters, clean and unmistakable. Something about a private estate, something about inheritance, something about legacy. His heart thudded once, hard enough to startle him. No, he muttered under his breath. He clicked the article. The photograph loaded slowly, as if the internet itself was savoring the moment. When it appeared, Michael felt his chest tighten so sharply he had to inhale through his nose just to steady himself. It was Eleanor. Not the Eleanor he remembered. Not the exhausted, grieving woman standing beside him at the funeral. Not the quiet, subdued version he had convinced himself would fade into the background of his life. This Eleanor looked calm, grounded, untouchable. She stood on the porch of a large home, sunlight spilling around her, one hand resting protectively on her baby. Her hair was pulled back simply, her face bare of makeup, yet there was something unmistakably different about her. She looked certain. Michael read the first paragraph, then the second, then the third. Each sentence landed heavier than the last. A private inheritance, decades of investments, a fortune carefully managed and intentionally concealed. The numbers blurred together, too large to process, too final to ignore. His chest began to ache, not metaphorically, but physically, a dull pressure spreading outward as realization took hold. No, he said again, louder this time. He read faster now, skimming, scanning, desperate for a sentence that would tell him he had misunderstood, that there was a mistake, that this wasn't real. But it was real. Every word confirmed it. Her father, the quiet man he had dismissed, the modest house, the unassuming life. Michael had been wrong about everything. His hands started to shake. He set the phone down, then picked it up again, staring at the photograph like it might change if he looked long enough. Eleanor had been wealthy. Not suddenly, not recently, all along. The realization hit him in waves. The times he'd complained about money, the questions he'd asked her father, disguised as curiosity, the assumptions he'd made about control, about leverage, about who needed whom. He felt sick. He stood abruptly, chair scraping loudly against the floor, and paced the length of the apartment. The walls felt closer than they had before, the air thicker. "This isn't fair," he muttered, though he wasn't sure who he was talking to. He grabbed his phone again and scrolled to her number. It rang once, twice, straight to voicemail. "Eleanor?" he said quickly when the beep sounded, his voice already edged with panic. "It's me. I saw something online. I think we need to talk. Please call me back." He hung up and immediately dialed again. Voicemail. He tried once more, then stopped, staring at the screen like it had betrayed him. His mind raced backward, replaying moments he once considered insignificant. The way Eleanor never panicked about money, the way her father insisted on paying quietly, without explanation, the way she'd never pushed back when Michael insisted on control. It all rearranged itself now, forming a picture he didn't like. She hadn't been dependent. She had been patient. Michael drove to her old house without thinking, muscle memory guiding him. When he pulled up, the driveway was empty. A small sign sat near the curb. "For sale." His stomach dropped. He sat in the car for several minutes, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the front door as if she might suddenly appear. She didn't. He drove away angry, then desperate, then afraid. Over the next few days, he tried everything. He sent long messages apologizing, explaining, reframing the past with language he hoped sounded sincere. He showed up at places he thought she might be. He asked mutual acquaintances questions thinly disguised as concern. No one gave him answers. Finally, someone forwarded him another article. This one mentioned a private property just outside the city, a quiet estate, a deliberate retreat. Michael drove there that same afternoon. The gate stopped him. A security guard stepped forward, polite but unmoved, listening as Michael spoke too quickly, too desperately. "I'm her husband," he said. "Ex-husband," the guard corrected calmly. "I just need to talk to her, please. She doesn't understand." "She understands," he said simply. "You need to leave." Michael stood there for a long moment, staring past the gate, imagining Eleanor inside, imagining her listening, imagining her reconsidering. But the gate didn't open. He left humiliated, anger curdling into something bitter and sharp. That night, he sat alone in his apartment, the article open again on his phone. He read the same lines, the same quotes, the same carefully chosen words describing Eleanor's life now. Private, protected, intentional. He realized then that nothing he said now would ever sound sincere. Not because he wasn't capable of regret, but because his regret had arrived too late. Across town, Eleanor sat in the soft glow of a bedside lamp, watching her son sleep. Thomas lay on his back, tiny chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. His face was relaxed, free of tension, untouched by the complications of the world that had shaped her so deeply. She brushed a finger gently along his cheek, marveling at how real he was, how complete. The house was quiet, but not empty. She thought briefly of Michael, not with anger, not with sadness, but with distance, like recalling a dream that no longer made sense in daylight. Grief had taught her something before wealth ever did. Some people leave not because you are unworthy, but because they are unwilling to stay when love requires more than convenience. She kissed Thomas's forehead and stood, adjusting the blanket around him. For the first time in a long while, her thoughts didn't drift backward. They stayed right where they were. Certain, peaceful, free. Life didn't soften overnight, but it steadied. At first, Eleanor noticed it in the smallest ways. The mornings stopped feeling like something she had to survive. The tightness in her chest loosened just enough for her to take a full breath before getting out of bed. The house no longer echoed with absence. It held quiet, and quiet became something she could live inside without flinching. She learned how to be alone without feeling lonely. That lesson came slowly, earned rather than discovered. It came in early mornings when she sat at the kitchen table with a mug of tea, sunlight pooling across the floor, Thomas asleep in the next room. It came in afternoons spent folding laundry while music played softly in the background, her body moving without hurry. It came in evenings when she chose silence over distraction and found that it no longer scared her. She built a routine not out of obligation, but out of care. Wake, feed Thomas, walk the property while the air was still cool, work in focused, measured hours, pause when her body or her heart asked her to pause. There was no one rushing her, no one waiting for her to fail or perform or explain herself. The absence of pressure felt unfamiliar at first, like stepping into open water after years of walking only along the edge. She learned how to trust her instincts again. For a long time, she had second-guessed herself without realizing it. She had learned to defer, to soften decisions, to check with someone else before committing to what she already knew was right. Now, when choices appeared, small ones or large ones, she listened inward before looking outward. And more often than not, she was right. Strength, she learned, didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it looked like saying no without apology. Sometimes it looked like resting instead of pushing through. Sometimes it looked like closing a door gently and not standing behind it to listen for footsteps. Sometimes it looked like peace. Years passed in this way, not dramatically, not loudly, but fully. Thomas grew from a baby who fit perfectly against her chest into a child who ran through the house with bare feet and endless questions. He filled the rooms with laughter and curiosity, his presence turning the house into something alive. Eleanor watched him become himself day by day and felt something close to wonder every time. She told him stories at night, sitting on the edge of his bed while the world outside dimmed. Stories about kindness, about patience, about mistakes that taught people who they were meant to be. She spoke carefully, choosing honesty without bitterness, truth without burden. One evening, when Thomas was old enough to ask questions that lingered, he looked at her thoughtfully and said, "Mama, what was Grandpa like?" The question caught her off guard, not because she hadn't expected it, but because of how gently it landed. She smiled and sat beside him. "He was kind," she said after a moment. "Quiet, but strong. He listened more than he spoke, and when he loved someone, he loved them in a way that didn't need attention." Thomas considered this, his brow furrowing slightly. "Did he know me?" Eleanor's chest tightened, but her voice stayed steady. "He knew you were coming, and he loved you before he ever met you." "How?" Thomas asked. She brushed his hair back gently. "He planned ahead. He wanted to make sure we'd always be okay." Thomas nodded, absorbing the answer in the way children do, accepting truth without needing every detail. "He loved us enough to plan ahead," she said softly, "and sometimes love shows up before we know we need it." Later that night, after Thomas had fallen asleep, Eleanor stood at the window watching the trees sway gently in the dark. The wind moved through their branches like a quiet conversation, steady and unhurried. The house felt settled around her, as if it had grown used to holding joy. Her son slept safely down the hall, one arm thrown over his pillow, his breathing slow and even. The sight filled her with a calm so deep it felt foundational. Life hadn't unfolded the way she once imagined. It had taken turns she wouldn't have chosen. It had asked things of her she hadn't known she could give. It had stripped away illusions and comfort and certainty, but it had also given her something stronger in return. Life doesn't always break us to punish us. Sometimes it breaks us open. Sometimes it clears the space so we can finally grow. Sometimes it removes what was never meant to stay. And sometimes the greatest power isn't proving someone wrong. It's building a life so full, so rooted in truth and love and peace that the people who once doubted you no longer matter at all. Eleanor turned away from the window, switched off the light, and walked quietly toward her son's room, carrying with her the certainty she had earned. This life was hers, and it was enough.